The glass was so cold, it burned as the water streamed down my head and soaked into my dress, dripping past my collar and clinging to my skin. My dad's voice cut through the silence at the table, sharp and merciless, telling me I was less than nothing. I blinked against the sting, feeling every pair of eyes locked on me, my humiliation hanging heavy in the air. Then my sister leaned forward, her smile cruel as she announced I was a humiliation to the family. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I couldn't move, frozen in the kind of shame that had followed me since childhood, the kind that always seemed to rise up stronger during moments like this. I wiped at my face with trembling fingers, though the effort was useless. My hair clung to my cheeks and neck, the droplets slipping into the neckline of my dress making me shiver. My fiancé, Michael, shifted beside me, his chair scraping back slightly. But before he could say anything, my dad slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. He told Michael to sit back down, that this was a family matter. The muscles in Michael's jaw tightened, and I could see the fury burning in his eyes. But he pressed his lips together and sat back, his hand brushing against mine under the table. It was the only comfort I had in that moment, a silent gesture that said he was still there for me even when the room was suffocating. The Christmas dinner had started with my mom fluttering about, making sure the roast was perfectly golden, the mashed potatoes creamy, the pies waiting on the counter. She loved the idea of presentation, of family togetherness, of appearances. She always moved like a hostess for strangers rather than a mother who knew the fragile state of her younger daughter. I had walked into the house with cautious hope, wanting to believe maybe this year would be different. Maybe they would notice me for more than my mistakes. Maybe they would see that I had carved out a life for myself without their approval. But by the time we all sat at the long dining table, with garlands draped along the windows and candles flickering in their holders, I felt the familiar knot return in my stomach. My dad's booming laugh filled the room. My sister's polished voice carried over everyone else's, and I was already fading into the background before the first bite was served. I had tried to engage in conversation, telling them about my new job, the projects I was excited to start, but my dad barely glanced my way. Jessica rolled her eyes and redirected the attention back to her recent achievements, her perfect promotion, her flawless apartment in the city. She knew exactly how to shine, and she did it with every word, leaving no space for mine to land. My mom poured wine for the guests and pretended not to notice the dismissal. And then just when I thought the humiliation would stop at words, my dad reached for the water glass, lifted it with an expression that almost looked casual, and tipped it over me in front of everyone. The shock of it silenced even Jessica for a moment. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. The coldness spread across me like an accusation I couldn't escape. I stared at the tablecloth, at the gravy boat and the cranberry sauce, wishing I could sink into the wood and disappear. My dad's words echoed less than nothing, and Jessica's laughter followed, sharp and cutting. She said the family could never be proud of someone like me, that I would never belong. My mom fluttered nervously with a napkin, dabbing at my shoulder but never meeting my eyes. Her lips formed a smile meant for the guests, as if the moment could be smoothed over if no one spoke of it directly. Inside, I felt the old ache return, the same ache from years of being overshadowed by Jessica, from hearing my dad's disappointment laced into his every word. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in the living room in a new red dress, hoping he would say I looked nice, and instead he told me Jessica would have worn it better. I remembered bringing home a report card with mostly A's, except for one B in math, and hearing him tell me it was never enough. I remembered the time in high school when Jessica won an award for debate, and I tried to share my own small art prize, only for him to cut me off and raise his glass to Jessica instead. Those moments had shaped me, carved me down, until I learned to swallow my pride and move quietly. But tonight the shame felt sharper than ever because I wasn't 12 anymore. I was 27, engaged, building a life of my own, and still my dad had the power to pour water on my head like I was an unruly child. Michael's hand tightened over mine under the table, a grounding pressure that reminded me I wasn't alone. I wanted to say something to push back, but my throat closed around the words. My chest rose and fell too quickly, panic fluttering in my lungs. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to focus on their plates, but the silence was deafening. I could hear the tick of the clock in the hallway, the clink of Jessica's fork against her plate as she smirked, the faint rustle of the pine branches on the mantel. Every detail pressed into me, making the room feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. I finally lifted my eyes to meet my dad's. His expression was smug, satisfied, like he had proven a point. His hand still rested near the empty glass, his knuckles thick and red from years of hard drinking and harder words. He didn't flinch when I looked at him. He never did. He believed his word was law, his judgment final. Jessica leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine as if the whole scene had been an amusing show put on for her benefit. My mom busied herself with the serving dishes, her face carefully neutral. It was always Jessica's voice that mattered, Jessica's laughter that filled the space, Jessica's achievements that were toasted. I was the reminder of imperfection, the crack in the polished surface. Michael cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. He said my dad had gone too far, that this wasn't respect, this was cruelty. My dad laughed, dismissing him with a wave of his hand, calling him naive, suggesting he had no idea what it meant to raise a family. Jessica jumped in, mocking Michael too, calling him a weak choice, saying I always settled for men who didn't belong in their world. Her words stabbed as deeply as the water soaking through my dress. My dad added that marrying me would be settling for less, that I could never bring pride to any man's name. The guests chuckled nervously, some shifting in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Every sound grated against me until I wanted to scream, but I didn't scream. I sat there trembling, my hands damp in Michael's grip, and I held my breath. Because somewhere in the corner of my mind, beneath the shame and the humiliation, something stirred. It was faint, almost too fragile to name, but it was there. A flicker of defiance. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the end of me. The sound of the front door opening broke through the tension. A gust of cold air swept into the dining room, carrying with it the sharp scent of winter. All heads turned as footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. I lifted my eyes and froze. A tall figure stood in the doorway, draped in furs, her presence commanding the entire room before she even spoke. My sister's smirk faltered. My dad's hand stiffened on the table. And for the first time that evening, the air shifted away from me. The woman's gaze swept over the room, landing on me where I sat drenched and silent. And in that instant, I knew nothing would be the same. Her voice carried across the dining room with a force that silenced everyone. "Touch her again and you are out." The words hung in the air like the crack of a whip, startling me as much as it stunned my dad and sister. I stared at her in disbelief. This woman who had appeared in the doorway like a storm blowing in from the night. The soft fur coat around her shoulders glistened with tiny snowflakes, her eyes sharp and unyielding. My dad's face drained of its smugness, his mouth opening and closing as if he could not find words. Jessica's hand tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles whitening. My mom stood frozen with the serving spoon still poised over the mashed potatoes. For the first time in my life, I saw them all speechless. I had never seen Margaret Whitmore in person, though I had heard her name. She was Michael's mother, the woman I had been so nervous to meet because of the stories I had heard about her wealth, her influence, and her reputation for being as fierce as she was elegant. She had not planned to arrive so soon. Michael had told me she was finishing a trip overseas and would not be able to join us for the holidays. Yet here she was, standing in my parents' dining room as if she had been summoned by the very cruelty that had been poured over my head. My dad finally broke the silence, his tone laced with forced authority. "This is our family's business. You have no right to interfere." He sounded smaller than I had ever heard him, like a man grasping for the control he thought he owned. Margaret stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Her gaze never wavered. Respect is not something you demand by humiliating your own blood. Respect is earned by how you treat those closest to you. And from what I just saw, you have failed at that in the worst way. Jessica scoffed, her voice dripping with indignation. "You do not know us. You do not know her. Luna has been nothing but a humiliation. She drags this family down, she always has." She tilted her head, the polished perfection in her features cracking just slightly, her desperation seeping through. Margaret's eyes shifted to her with a chill that made my sister falter. "The only humiliation here is how you treat your sister." Her words landed with a thud that made my chest tighten. For years, I had wanted someone to say those words for me, someone to call it what it really was. My heart raced, torn between gratitude and fear of what this moment might unleash. Michael rose from his seat, his hand resting on my shoulder. "Mom, please, you do not have to do this." He looked at her with both relief and concern, as if he too was surprised by her sudden appearance. Margaret did not take her eyes off my dad. "If I do not do this, who will? I will not stand by while cruelty disguises itself as parenting." The room pulsed with her authority, her presence filling every corner. For once, the dining table felt less like a stage for my dad's dominance and more like the place where his mask might finally crack. My dad leaned back in his chair, his face red with anger. He told her she was overstepping, that I had always been a disappointment, that everyone knew it. The words dug into me as they always had, But Margaret stepped closer, her voice calm yet cutting. "Say it again and you will regret it." Her tone was icy steel, and for a brief second, I thought she might actually strike him if he dared. My sister's lips pressed together, her eyes darting between my dad and Margaret, calculating how much power she was losing in this shift. I sat rigid, my mind replaying the scene again and again. The shock of water dripping down my dress, the humiliation in Jessica's smirk, my dad's words branding me less than nothing. And now this woman, powerful and uncompromising, standing in my defense. The room had turned upside down in minutes. I hardly knew what to think, except that a door had opened to something I had never imagined. For years I had lived with silence pressed against my lips. Now someone else was breaking it wide open. The guests shifted uneasily. One elderly aunt cleared her throat and muttered about the turkey getting cold. My mom forced a laugh that came out brittle, urging everyone to eat while trying to pretend nothing monumental had just happened, but no one reached for the food. All eyes were locked on Margaret and my dad, waiting for whichever blow would come next. I swallowed hard, tasting salt on my lips. It was not just the water, it was the tears I had been holding back, tears that refused to fall in front of them. I straightened my spine, forcing myself not to shrink away. Not now, when someone had finally given me the dignity of defense. Margaret turned her gaze to me then. Her eyes softened for the briefest moment, her expression shifting from sharp anger to something like resolve. "From this day you will stand taller. Do not ever let them convince you that you are less." Her words struck something inside me that had long been buried. I wanted to believe her, but disbelief tangled with the shame that had lived in me for years. I lowered my eyes, afraid of how much I needed her words, how deeply they cut through the darkness I had carried. My dad huffed, muttering that Margaret had no idea what she was talking about. He said I was weak, that I had never measured up, that my sister was the one worthy of pride. Jessica nodded eagerly, her smile restored as she clung to his approval like a badge of honor. She leaned across the table and said I was only pretending at strength, that Michael would see it soon enough, that no amount of pity from his mother could change who I really was. Her voice sliced at me, daring me to crumble in front of them. I felt my hands tremble against my lap, but Margaret spoke before I could. "Weakness is in cruelty, not compassion. If you think tearing your sister apart makes you strong, then you have already lost." Jessica's smile faltered again, and she quickly looked down at her plate. Michael reached for my hand openly now, no longer hiding the gesture beneath the table. His palm was warm, steady. I squeezed it back, my chest filling with the strange mixture of fear and courage. For years I had been invisible, the silent one in a family that thrived on crushing me. Now, for the first time, they looked uncertain. They looked small. The chandelier light caught the crystal glasses, casting fractured patterns across the table, as if even the light wanted to shatter their illusion. The evening stumbled on, though no one truly ate. My mom insisted we carry on filling plates with food that no one touched. The air was thick with tension, every word clipped, every motion deliberate. Margaret remained seated, her posture regal, her eyes watchful. I felt her presence beside me like a shield, and I leaned into that feeling, allowing myself a breath I hadn't been able to take since I walked into this house. For the first time, I did not feel completely alone. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the guests excused themselves as quickly as politeness allowed, my dad stormed into the living room. Jessica followed close behind, their voices low but sharp. My mom busied herself in the kitchen, rattling dishes with more force than necessary. Margaret guided me to the couch, sitting beside me with a composure that made the chaos beyond the doorway seem distant. She placed her hand gently over mine and whispered, so only I could hear, "They will try again. People like this always do. But tonight, remember that you were defended, and you will be defended again if you need it." I swallowed, my throat aching. Why? Why would you do this for me? Margaret's gaze held mine firmly. "Because I see strength where they see weakness. Because I will not let them break you any longer." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I forced them back. I wanted to cling to her words, to let them wash away the years of being less than nothing, but I was afraid of believing in something too good. Still, something inside me shifted. A tiny seed of resolve planted itself, fragile yet undeniable. I knew this night had changed something forever. And though fear still curled around me, there was also the smallest spark of hope. The tension in the room clung to the walls like smoke that refused to lift. After Margaret's arrival, dinner had limped along in fractured silence, each fork scraping against china sounding louder than usual, every word from my dad forced and brittle. I sat there, stiffly, still damp from the humiliation, my dress clinging to me uncomfortably, the smell of turkey and cranberry sauce mixing with the faint scent of wet fabric. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as I tried to steady myself. Across from me, Jessica shifted in her seat, her face carefully arranged into a mask of composure, though I caught the flicker of anger in her eyes whenever Margaret's gaze lingered on her. My mom smiled tightly at the remaining guests, her lips trembling as she offered more pie, her voice pitched too high to disguise the unease that had settled over the entire table. When the last of the guests left, murmuring polite goodbyes and casting awkward glances back at us, the house seemed to exhale. The door shut with a heavy thud, and the silence that followed was almost worse. My dad stood by the fireplace, pouring himself another drink, his movements sharp. Jessica perched on the arm of the sofa, swirling the wine in her glass as though trying to reassert control. My mom busied herself stacking plates, her back turned. I sat on the edge of a chair, my hands folded in my lap, the dampness against my skin a constant reminder of what had just happened. Margaret remained by my side, her posture unshaken, her presence commanding the room without a word. My dad finally spoke, his voice hard. "This is our home. We will not be lectured in our own home." He turned to Margaret, his eyes narrowing. "You had no right to insert yourself into this family's matters." Jessica's voice chimed in quickly, eager to back him. "She has no idea what it is like living with Luna. Always disappointing us, always failing. She has embarrassed us more times than I can count." Her words burned, but Margaret did not flinch. Instead, she let the silence stretch until Jessica's confidence wavered. Then Margaret's voice, calm and steady, filled the room. "The embarrassment lies not in Luna, but in the cruelty you dress as discipline. The shame belongs to those who break their own." Her words hit the room like a blow. My dad scoffed, taking a gulp of his drink, but his shoulders tensed. Jessica tried to laugh it off, though the sound was brittle. My mom muttered something about clearing the dishes, her hands shaking as she gathered silverware. I sat frozen, my heart pounding. Margaret's defense both warmed me and unsettled me. No one had ever spoken for me like that before. I could not stop thinking about how different the air felt now, heavy with truths that had never been allowed to surface in this house. Margaret leaned closer to me, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You have to remember, silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it is the strongest weapon." Her words struck deep, reminding me of the years I had swallowed my anger, convinced my quietness was proof of failure. I wondered if she saw something in me that I could not yet see in myself. My dad suddenly slammed his glass down on the mantel, startling everyone. "Enough of this." He turned to Michael, his eyes sharp. "Do you see what kind of woman you are marrying? She cannot even stand on her own. She hides behind others." His words sliced through me, the familiar sting of being diminished. But Michael stood his hand firm on my shoulder. "I see someone stronger than you will ever admit. I see someone who has endured years of cruelty and still finds the courage to love. I will not let you rewrite her into your failures." His voice shook slightly, but the conviction in his eyes made my throat tighten. Jessica snapped, her mask cracking. "You are blinded by pity. She is nothing compared to me. She is a constant reminder of weakness." She glared at me as if daring me to crumble under her words. My fingers dug into my palms, my body trembling. But Margaret's steady hand on my back anchored me. She looked straight at Jessica. "The only weakness I see is in the way you step on your sister to keep yourself above water. That is not strength. That is desperation." Jessica's face flushed red, her lips parting in outrage, but no words came. My dad muttered under his breath, pacing near the window, his hand gripping the glass too tightly. My mom's eyes darted nervously, silently pleading for the storm to pass. But it was not passing, it was only beginning. As the night stretched on, the house settled into smaller skirmishes. My dad muttered with Jessica in the corner, whispering strategies as though Margaret's presence was a challenge to overcome. I could hear fragments of their words. "She cannot be allowed to embarrass us again. We need to show them who we are." Jessica's voice was urgent, tight. Margaret pretended not to notice, sipping her tea calmly, though I saw the way her eyes flicked toward them, sharp and knowing. She leaned closer to me again. "Do not fear their plotting. They are scrambling because they feel their power slipping." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I had never thought of my family as afraid of anything, but the idea settled in me unsettling and strange. Later, when I retreated to my room, Michael followed, closing the door gently behind him. He sat beside me on the edge of the bed, his eyes searching mine. "Are you all right?" The question was simple, but it undid me. My throat burned as I whispered that I did not know. I felt humiliated, exposed, yet strangely lighter. He took my hand, brushing his thumb across my knuckles. "You have been carrying this alone for too long." His words broke something open in me. and for a moment I let myself lean into his shoulder, closing my eyes against the weight of the night. Downstairs, I could still hear my dad's voice, low and angry, Jessica's sharper tone threading through his. Margaret's voice never rose, but I could imagine her holding her ground, unshaken. A strange thought surfaced in me then. Maybe I did not have to carry this battle alone anymore. Maybe someone else had finally stepped into the storm with me. The idea both comforted and frightened me. I had spent so long expecting abandonment that I hardly knew how to accept defense. As I lay awake later, the house creaked with the settling of winter, the faint hum of the furnace filling the silence. My body still felt chilled, my skin sensitive from the soaked dress. But inside, a different fire stirred. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. From this day you will stand taller. The weight of years pressed against me, the memories of every dismissal, every insult, every comparison to Jessica. For so long I had believed them. But tonight something shifted. For the first time, I wondered if their cruelty said more about them than about me. The storm had not ended. It had only changed direction. I closed my eyes, listening to the muffled voices downstairs, knowing this battle was far from over. Yet for once, I felt a glimmer of strength beneath the fear. I was not broken. Not yet, and maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to rise. The morning after that dinner felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I woke up in my old bedroom, the same pale wallpaper I had stared at as a teenager, peeling slightly at the corners, the smell of pine faintly drifting in from the yard. My body felt heavy, the weight of humiliation and exhaustion pressing down on me, but something else stirred underneath, something new that I couldn't quite name. I lay there listening to the muffled voices downstairs, the clink of dishes, my mother's light footsteps. The memories of last night flooded back, my dad's cruel words, the icy water sliding down my hair, Jessica's laughter, and then the sudden shift when Margaret had walked in like a storm. For once, I hadn't been left to drown alone. That thought gave me enough strength to push the blankets aside and swing my feet onto the carpet. When I stepped into the hallway, I heard sharp whispers rising from the living room. My dad's voice was harsh and low, full of anger. He said Margaret had humiliated him in his own house, that no one had ever dared to speak to him like that before. Jessica chimed in her words fast and desperate, saying they had to take back control, that letting Margaret interfere would ruin everything. I leaned closer to the banister, my breath catching. My dad muttered about debts and business, about not letting anyone know how much trouble he was in. Jessica promised she would find a way to fix it, that Michael could be turned against me if she worked on him the right way. My stomach dropped as I realized they were already planning their next move, scheming against me even after everything that had happened. I moved back before the floor creaked beneath me, retreating into the kitchen where the smell of coffee greeted me. My mom stood by the counter carefully pouring it into a mug. Her hands trembled just slightly, though she smiled when she saw me. She asked if I had slept, her voice overly bright, as if pretending could smooth away the wreckage of last night. I nodded, though my throat was tight, and reached for the mug she handed me. The warmth seeped into my palms, and for a moment I just held it there, wishing the heat could thaw the chill that seemed lodged inside my chest. Margaret walked into the kitchen then, her fur coat replaced with a simple sweater, her presence still commanding even in something so ordinary. She greeted me with a nod, her eyes steady on mine. She asked if I was all right. I hesitated, then admitted quietly that I wasn't sure. She moved closer, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You have endured what no one should. But you cannot let their cruelty define you any longer." Her voice was calm but strong, and I felt the words sink into me. I asked her why she had stood up for me, why she had chosen to intervene when she could have stayed away. Because she said simply, "I refuse to watch people destroy someone who has done nothing but try to live. I see strength in you, Luna, even if you do not yet see it yourself." Her words made my throat tighten. For so long I had carried silence as a burden, convinced it was weakness. Now she was telling me it could be something else entirely. I thought of all the years I had swallowed my anger, all the times I had walked away rather than fight. Maybe she was right. Maybe silence was not surrender but survival. And maybe if I learned how it could become something sharper. The day dragged on in a haze. My dad avoided me, though his heavy footsteps upstairs told me he was restless. Jessica flitted around the house with a smile plastered on her face, pretending nothing had happened whenever Margaret was near, but glaring daggers at me when she thought no one was looking. My mom kept herself busy in the kitchen, humming tunelessly, her nervous energy filling the air. I stayed close to Michael and Margaret, though even with them beside me, I felt a constant weight pressing at the edges of my chest. In the afternoon, Margaret pulled me aside into the den. She told me that people like my dad and sister thrived on control, and when control slipped, they grew desperate. They would come at me harder, but that desperation was their weakness. "You must learn not to react with fear," she said. "Look them in the eye. Let them see that you will not break." Her voice was firm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something other than dread. I asked her how I could possibly stand up to them when they had spent my whole life teaching me I was worthless. Margaret's expression softened. "Because their cruelty is not truth. It is a mirror of their own emptiness. You are not the weakness they say you are. You are the proof of their failure to love." The words struck deep, almost too much to take in at once. I nodded slowly, feeling both terrified and strangely alive. That evening, as we sat down to another tense dinner, Jessica could not resist taking jabs. She talked about her job, her success, her perfect life, slipping in remarks about how some people never manage to rise above mediocrity. She looked at me pointedly, waiting for me to shrink. My dad grunted in agreement, raising his glass as if to toast Jessica. The familiar heat rose in my chest, the old instinct to look away, to swallow my words. But Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. "Look them in the eye." I lifted my gaze and met Jessica's stare head-on. My voice shook at first, but I said that I was done being her punching bag, that her success meant nothing if it depended on tearing someone else down. The words hung in the air heavier than I expected. Jessica's face flushed, her lips parting in shock. My dad slammed his fork down, his eyes narrowing, but Margaret leaned forward calmly, reminding him that respect was earned, not demanded. The table went silent. My mom glanced between us, her face pale, her hands trembling around the serving spoon. Jessica sputtered, trying to recover, saying that I was ungrateful, that I owed everything to them, that I would be nothing without their name. I felt my pulse pounding, but I held her gaze, refusing to drop my eyes. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Margaret's eyes sparkled with approval, and Michael squeezed my hand under the table. My dad muttered darkly, calling me defiant, warning that I would regret speaking back. But I did not shrink this time. I sat straighter, the trembling in my hands slowly steadying. After dinner, Jessica cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was sharp, her smile gone. "You think this changes anything? You think one moment of courage makes you stronger than me? You will always be beneath me." Her eyes burned into mine, but before I could respond, Margaret's voice came from behind us. "That is enough." Jessica spun around, startled, as Margaret stepped closer. She told Jessica that cruelty masked fear, and fear was never strength. Jessica's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more, retreating with a huff. Margaret looked at me then and nodded. "You did well. It is only the beginning, but you did well." That night, lying in bed, I replayed every moment. My dad's threats, Jessica's fury, Margaret's steady encouragement. For years, my silence had been my cage, the proof of my defeat. Tonight, it had become something else, the foundation for a different kind of strength. I wasn't free yet. The storm in this house was far from over. But for the first time, I believed I might learn to stand in it without bowing my head. That night, I barely slept, the voices of my dad and Jessica echoing in my head long after the house had gone quiet. Every whisper I had overheard came back to me. They were already planning, already scheming, trying to figure out how to use Michael against me, how to restore the control they felt slipping through their hands. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the curtains shifting across the pale walls, my body tense with the certainty that they would not stop. Margaret's words repeated in my mind, telling me not to fear their plotting, telling me that desperation was their weakness. I wanted to believe her, but the years of being under their thumb made it hard to trust that anything could truly change. In the morning, the house was strangely calm. My mom moved about the kitchen, humming in a strained way as she fried bacon and scrambled eggs. Her smile stretched too thin when I entered. She asked if I had slept, and I lied, saying yes, though my eyes felt heavy and my hands trembled when I poured myself coffee. Michael joined me at the table, his hair mussed, his face still lined with exhaustion. He squeezed my knee under the table, a quiet reassurance, but even he seemed unsettled. I caught Jessica watching us from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of calculation and disdain. She gave me a tight smile, one that held no warmth, and then disappeared back upstairs. Later that morning, I overheard another conversation. My dad was in his study, the door only half closed, his voice low and sharp. He spoke on the phone about money, about deadlines he could not meet. I caught phrases that chilled me, words like foreclosure and unpaid loan and desperate investors. I realized then that the confidence he had always worn like armor was beginning to crack. He was drowning in debts, and he was terrified of being exposed. I backed away quietly, my pulse racing. For so long I had thought of him as untouchable, the towering figure who controlled every room he entered. But behind that door I had seen the truth. He was not untouchable at all. He was vulnerable. In the afternoon, Margaret asked to speak with me privately. She guided me into the den, closing the door behind us. She told me that families like mine thrived on illusion, that they wore masks of perfection to hide the rot underneath. She said she had seen it many times before in business and society, even among friends who pretended loyalty while stabbing each other in the back. She said my dad's debts were the crack in his mask, and that crack would widen until it consumed him. I asked her what that meant for me, for Michael. She told me that as long as I stood firm, as long as I refused to accept their narrative, I could watch them collapse under their own lies. She told me I had to stop apologizing for existing, that I had to start believing in my own strength. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to cling to the possibility that I could finally be free of their grip. Dinner that evening was staged like a performance. My dad smiled too widely, his voice unnaturally cheerful as he carved the roast chicken. Jessica laughed at all the right moments, leaning across the table to compliment Michael on his career, pretending she cared about his work. My mom poured wine and asked polite questions, her eyes flicking nervously between my dad and Margaret. I felt the falseness of it pressing down on me, every gesture rehearsed, every word carefully chosen to maintain appearances. My dad began to talk about business, about legacy, about family pride. He looked at Michael, his smile tight. He spoke of opportunities of investments that could secure the future. I watched Michael listen politely, though I saw the doubt in his eyes. My dad pressed harder, suggesting that joining with him would benefit everyone, that marrying me would tie Michael to a family with long-standing respect in the community. His words tasted bitter to me, because I knew the truth he was hiding behind them. Jessica leaned in, then her voice sweet and sharp at once. She told Michael that she admired ambition, that she valued success, and that she hoped he would surround himself with people who could rise with him instead of holding him back. Her eyes flicked to me with a glint of satisfaction. I felt my chest tighten, my breath quicken, but I remembered Margaret's voice telling me to hold my ground. I looked Jessica straight in the eye and asked her if that was how she built her own achievements, by stepping on me every chance she got. Her smile faltered, and for once she did not have a ready answer. The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile, her approval quiet but steady. Michael reached for my hand openly this time, and I saw the flush rise in Jessica's cheeks. The meal dragged on, every word a battle beneath the surface. My dad continued to weave his stories of success. Jessica continued to try to undermine me. My mother continued to pretend everything was normal. But I could feel the undercurrents shifting. I could feel the mask slipping. The more they tried to hold it in place, the more obvious the cracks became. Later that night, when the table had been cleared and the house had grown quiet again, a phone rang in my dad's pocket. His face paled as he listened, his voice rising in anger as he paced the living room. He told the caller that they needed more time, that the money would come, that everything was under control. But the voice on the other end was loud enough for all of us to hear, threatening legal action, threatening to expose him publicly. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jessica's face drained of color. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding. Margaret watched calmly, her expression unreadable, but when she caught my eye, she gave the slightest nod as if to say, "Do you see now? This is how it begins." My dad hung up the phone, his hand trembling, his face red with fury and shame. He barked at us all to leave him alone, retreating into his study and slamming the door. Jessica rushed after him, her voice desperate, telling him they would find a way to fix it. My mother sat down heavily on the couch, her eyes blank, her body sagging as though the weight of years had suddenly collapsed onto her shoulders. The house felt different in that moment, not just tense, but fragile, as if the foundation itself had begun to crack. I went to bed that night with my mind racing. The humiliation I had endured still ached like a wound, but something else had taken root inside me. For the first time, I saw my family not as untouchable tyrants, but as desperate people clinging to illusions that were slipping away. I thought of Margaret's words, of the way she had stood unshaken, of the strength she seemed to see in me. I thought of Michael's hand steady in mine, of the way he looked at me as if I was more than the sum of their cruelty. I realized that maybe I could survive this storm not by running or hiding, but by standing in it and letting their lies collapse under their own weight. The night was long, the house restless with muffled arguments and slammed doors. I lay awake, listening, the cold air pressing against the window panes, my body tense but my mind alive with a new clarity. The cracks in their facade were spreading, and though fear still curled around me, there was also something sharper, something that felt dangerously like hope. The morning light slipped through the blinds, painting lines across the floor, but my body felt heavy, weighed down by the memories of the night before. My dad's voice still echoed in my ears, his desperate bargaining with a creditor, the fury when he realized others had hurt him. Jessica's frantic promises rang just as loud. Her vow that she would find a way to fix everything. I knew what that meant. I knew she would come for me again, not with water or words at the dinner table, but with sharper weapons, the ones that could slice deeper and leave scars no one could see. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped, my breath uneven, while Michael slept soundly beside me, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a moment I let my gaze linger on him, the one constant in this storm, the one person who hadn't looked away when the worst of my family's cruelty had come crashing down. Downstairs I could hear movement, Jessica's heels clicking across the hardwood, my dad's heavy tread pacing back and forth, the low murmur of their voices. My mom's softer tones floated through occasionally, but she always sounded like someone trying to keep a fragile balance that had already broken. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly. Today would not be peaceful. Today, something would shift again, and I had to be ready. When I finally stepped into the hallway, Jessica was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her arms crossed over her chest, her smile tight. She greeted me sweetly, her voice edged with poison. She asked if I had slept well, tilting her head just enough to let me know she wasn't interested in the answer. Michael joined me, his arm brushing against mine as he came down the last step, and Jessica's smile widened. She leaned in just slightly, telling him that she wanted to catch up, that they had so much to talk about. The way her eyes lingered on him made my stomach twist. I had seen that look before, when we were younger, and she had set her sights on something I had loved, not because she wanted it, but because she wanted to take it from me. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the den, her gaze cool as she watched Jessica. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to make my sister's shoulders stiffen. Jessica excused herself with another forced smile, but not before whispering as she passed me, telling me that one display of courage didn't change what I was. Her words cut, but I refused to drop my eyes. Margaret's voice carried softly once Jessica was gone. "They are terrified, Luna. They will dig deeper now, but you must not give them the reaction they want." I knotted my throat tight, wishing I could summon the strength she seemed so sure I possessed. Later that day, my dad announced a family dinner, saying it was important that we all sit down together and put things behind us. The way he said it made my skin crawl. It was not an invitation, it was a performance, another stage set for him to display control. My mom busied herself setting the table again, her movements frantic, her eyes avoiding mine. Jessica spent the afternoon in her room, but when she emerged, she was dressed with the kind of precision that made it clear she wanted attention. Her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her dress clinging in all the ways she knew would draw eyes. She smiled too sweetly at Michael, asking if he was ready for another night of family tradition. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to remember Margaret's words. Silence could be power. I didn't need to play Jessica's game. I only needed to hold steady. At the dinner table, the tension returned like an old friend. My dad raised his glass, speaking of forgiveness and moving forward, as though the past days had been simple misunderstandings. He praised Jessica for her grace, for her loyalty, for her strength. Each word felt like a dagger meant for me. Then Jessica leaned in, her voice soft but loud enough for everyone to hear, telling Michael how admirable it was that he stood by me, but that he deserved someone who could rise to his level. She smiled at him, her hand brushing his arm in a way that made bile rise in my throat. I looked at her, my pulse racing, but instead of shrinking, I let the silence stretch. I stared back at her until her smile flickered, until she shifted slightly in her seat. Then I said steady, though my hands trembled under the table, that loyalty was not built on comparison, it was built on truth, and that truth would always outlast cruelty. The room fell quiet. Jessica's face flushed, her lips parted, but no sharp comeback came immediately. My dad growled that I was being disrespectful, that I was ungrateful. But Michael's voice rose firmly, telling him that enough was enough. He said he chose me, that he had seen my strength even when I couldn't see it myself, and that no amount of gossip or manipulation would change that. Jessica's eyes widened, her mask cracking just slightly before she forced another brittle smile. My mom set down her fork with a clatter, muttering that we should change the subject, but the damage was done. The illusion had splintered again. After dinner, Jessica cornered me in the hallway, her perfume strong, her voice low and sharp. She told me I was pathetic for thinking Michael's loyalty meant I had won. She said people like him always realized eventually that women like me were dead weight. She promised she would make sure he saw me for what I really was. I felt my stomach tighten, but before I could speak, Margaret stepped into the hallway. Her gaze locked on Jessica, and she said quietly that strength wasn't measured by who could shout the loudest or cut the deepest. Strength was measured by who could stand when others tried to knock them down. Jessica's face reddened, but she said nothing more. She stormed past, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. That night, when the house grew quiet again, I sat on the edge of the bed, my body trembling with the aftershocks of the day. Michael sat beside me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders, telling me that he believed in me, that nothing my family said could undo what we had. His words soothed me, but in the back of my mind, I could still hear my dad and Jessica plotting, still feel the weight of their intent. They would not stop. They would come harder. But as I leaned into Michael's shoulder as Margaret's words echoed in my mind, I realized I no longer felt entirely helpless. Fear still lingered, but alongside it was something steadier, a quiet strength, fragile but growing. For the first time, I began to believe that maybe silence wasn't my cage after all. Maybe it was becoming my weapon. The moment I stepped into the living room that evening, I knew something had shifted. My dad's voice carried through the house loud and deliberate, echoing as though he wanted every neighbor to hear. He stood near the mantel, his drink in hand, his posture tall and rigid, while Jessica hovered close to his side like a shadow feeding his words. A few relatives had gathered, cousins I rarely saw, and an uncle who lived nearby. They sat uncomfortably in the armchairs, their expressions caught between politeness and unease. My dad's booming tone filled the space. He said he had always tried to protect the family's reputation, that he had sacrificed everything for appearances, and that I was the one who had dragged it down time and again. Jessica chimed in quickly, her voice smooth, her eyes glinting as they slid toward me. She told them I had never followed through on anything, that I had abandoned projects, let opportunities slip away, that I had embarrassed the family more times than they could count. She leaned forward as though confiding in the group, saying she had always done her best to cover for me, but it was impossible to hide my failures forever. My hands clenched at my sides, heat rising in my chest, but I stayed still. Every eye in the room turned toward me as if waiting to see whether I would crumble. For a moment, my throat tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears, the familiar shame creeping back like a shadow that had lived in me for years. Margaret sat in the corner of the room, her presence calm and watchful. She crossed one leg over the other, her eyes trained on my dad and sister, with an expression that gave nothing away. I looked at her and remembered her words. Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it is the strongest weapon. I took a deep breath, letting the tension settle in me, not as something that broke me, but as something I could use. My dad's voice rang out again, calling me less than reliable, saying even my engagement would not last because Michael would soon see me for what I was. The words were meant to destroy, but this time they landed differently. I could feel them pass through me instead of sinking in. Jessica smirked, emboldened by his attack. She asked Michael if he really knew the woman he was planning to marry, if he knew how easily I gave up, if he knew the truth of my past. She leaned toward him, her tone sweet, her eyes sharp. Michael's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his hand brushing against mine where we stood side by side. I lifted my head, my voice shaking but clear. At least I do not quit on people I claim to love. The room fell silent. Jessica's smile faltered, her cheeks reddening. My dad scoffed, saying I was being dramatic, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. For the first time, my words had unsettled him. Margaret's voice filled the pause, calm and deliberate. Weakness is in cruelty, not in compassion. She let the words hang in the air, her gaze sweeping the room until even the relatives shifted in their seats. My dad's mouth tightened. Jessica looked away, and I felt a surge of something foreign but steady. Strength. For the first time, I was not the one shrinking in the corner. For the first time, I had made them falter. Dinner followed, though it felt more like a battlefield than a meal. Jessica tried again, her remarks aimed at undermining me, but I stayed steady, letting her words roll off, answering when I chose with calm defiance. She told Michael he deserved someone who could match his ambition, someone who was not dragging him down. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, smiling with practiced charm. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself not to react. I met her gaze, my voice low but even. If you think money and charm can buy loyalty, maybe that explains why you are always chasing, never keeping. Her face flushed, her smile cracking, and for a brief second, I saw the insecurity beneath her mask. Margaret's eyes gleamed with approval. Michael sat up straighter, his hand resting openly over mine, his loyalty clear to everyone at the table. The rest of the meal dragged on in stilted silence. My mother busied herself with serving dishes, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She avoided my eyes, pretending not to hear the undercurrents in the room. My dad forced conversation about business, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. Jessica stabbed at her food, her appetite gone, her expression tight with barely concealed anger. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, murmuring about the weather, trying to steer the evening back to neutral ground. But the damage was done. The mask had slipped again, and they all knew it. Later, when the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, Michael found me in the hallway. He looked at me with an intensity that made my chest ache. Do not ever doubt yourself. I chose you. And now I see even clearer why. His words were steady, his gaze unwavering. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I swallowed them back. For once I did not feel like the weaker one. For once I felt seen. But just as the night seemed to settle, I heard whispers again. My dad and Jessica in the study, their voices sharp, their words cutting through the stillness. If we cannot break her, we will ruin her. Jessica's voice was colder than I had ever heard it. Then let us expose her weaknesses, every dirty little secret. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. This was not just about rivalry anymore. This was a plan deliberate and cruel, designed to destroy me completely. I slipped back into the hallway, the shadows swallowing me as their words echoed in my ears. My hands trembled, my body cold, but inside something steadier stirred. They were plotting against me, yes. But for the first time, I was not afraid in the same way. For the first time, I knew I was not alone. Margaret's unwavering presence, Michael's loyalty, even the faint spark of strength I had begun to uncover in myself, all of it stood between me and their cruelty. The battle was far from over. It was only beginning. And though fear still curled around me, so did resolve. The morning after their whispered plotting, I woke with the uneasy sense that eyes were on me even when no one was in the room. The house felt different, charged with a quiet hostility that pressed against my skin. I tried to shake it off as I dressed, pulling on jeans and a sweater, but the feeling lingered. When I stepped into the hallway, Jessica was already there, her phone in hand. Her lips curved into a smirk she didn't bother to hide. She tucked her phone away quickly when she saw me, but not before I caught the faint glimpse of my name on the glowing screen. My stomach tightened. She didn't speak, only let her smile widen before she walked past me, her perfume hanging in the air like a taunt. Downstairs, Michael was waiting at the kitchen table, his hair still damp from the shower, his fingers drumming against the mug of coffee in front of him. He looked up when he saw me and immediately frowned. "Have you seen what's online?" His words made my pulse quicken. He slid his phone across the table to me, and my hands trembled as I picked it up. On the screen were posts anonymous but pointed, filled with lies about me. Someone claimed I had borrowed money from friends and never paid it back. Another post suggested I had been unfaithful in past relationships, calling me manipulative, untrustworthy. Pictures of me from years ago had been dredged up, cropped and twisted to look incriminating. My chest constricted as I scrolled each word another dagger. The bile rose in my throat, but I forced it back down. My name was spreading like poison, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Jessica strolled into the kitchen as if on cue, her voice sweet as honey. "Oh, Luna, you look pale. Is everything all right?" Her eyes flicked toward Michael, her expression feigning concern, though the satisfaction shimmered just beneath. My lips parted, but no words came. My dad entered, then his heavy footsteps filling the space, his voice booming about family reputation and how I was dragging it lower by the day. He muttered that appearances had to be maintained, that the family name mattered more than my feelings. Margaret walked in behind him, her gaze sweeping the room, catching the tension instantly. She asked to see the phone in my hand, and when I passed it to her, she read a few lines before lifting her eyes. Her expression did not waver, but I saw the storm in her gaze. "Lies spread fast," she said evenly, "but they burn out faster when faced with truth." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, and my dad poured himself coffee, muttering about outsiders meddling in family affairs. The rest of the day unfolded like a nightmare stretched thin. People in town started looking at me differently. A neighbor who had always smiled at me crossed the street instead of waving. My phone buzzed with messages from acquaintances, some curious, others cruel. I wanted to crawl into myself to hide, but Margaret would not let me. She guided me to the den, closing the door behind us. She told me that this was their way of cornering me, of forcing me to collapse under shame. She told me that shame only lived if I accepted it. "Do not chase lies," she said firmly. "Let the truth reveal itself." Then she leaned closer, her eyes steady on mine. "But be ready to act. Your silence can hold power, but your truth can cut deeper." Her words stayed with me that evening when my dad insisted we all attend a small gathering at a business associate's home. It was meant to be another display of family pride, another chance for him to parade Jessica's accomplishments while pretending everything was perfect. I did not want to go, but Michael insisted he would be by my side, and Margaret's steady presence gave me courage. The house we entered was brightly lit, laughter spilling out as people mingled, but I felt every stare the moment we walked in. Whispers carried across the room, half-hidden glances cutting into me. Jessica thrived in it, her laughter loud, her voice carrying as she spoke glowingly of her work, her connections, her ambitions. She leaned in close to Michael, her words dripping with suggestion that he could do better, that he needed someone who matched his success. My hands clenched at my sides, but Michael's grip on my fingers steadied me. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying, saying he stood with me, that no rumor or manipulation would change that. Jessica's smile faltered, her face flushing as a few guests exchanged knowing looks. My dad tried to recover, launching into a speech about his legacy, about the strength of the Hong family, about the pride he had built over the years. He spoke too loudly, his words too polished, and for the first time, I saw the unease in the listeners' eyes. One businessman leaned toward Margaret quietly, asking if it was true about my dad's debts. Margaret didn't answer directly. She only smiled faintly and said some secrets reveal themselves at the right time. Her words were simple, but I saw how they unsettled Jessica and my dad. Their masks slipped just slightly, enough for me to glimpse the fear behind their performance. Later, when the evening wound down and we returned home, Jessica's fury finally cracked through. She cornered me in the hallway, her face inches from mine, her words like venom. "You think this will last? You think he will keep standing by you when everyone sees what you are?" She spat the words with such force that her spit landed on my cheek. My hands trembled, but I held her gaze, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. Margaret's voice interrupted again, sharp and unyielding. "Enough!" Jessica stepped back, her face red, her chest heaving, but she said no more. Margaret's eyes met mine, and for the first time that day, I let myself believe that maybe the lies would not win. That night, Michael sat with me in the quiet of my old bedroom. He told me the rumors had shaken him, that he would be lying if he said they hadn't. But then he looked me in the eyes and said he knew the truth. He told me that no post, no whisper, no manipulation could erase what he saw when he looked at me. His voice was steady, his hand warm around mine, and I felt something loosen in my chest. I had spent so long believing that the world only saw me through their cruelty. But now, with him and Margaret beside me, I could feel a different story beginning to form. The house was quiet when I finally lay down, but I knew sleep would not come easily. My dad and Jessica were not finished. Their desperation was growing, and I could hear it in every sharp word, see it in every crack of their masks. They would come harder, they would dig deeper, and they would stop at nothing to destroy me. But as I closed my eyes, Margaret's words echoed in my mind. "Do not chase lies. Use truth as your blade." For the first time, I felt that maybe I had a weapon of my own, waiting to be sharpened. The first sign that my dad's empire was cracking came not from him, but from the look on the faces of the men he had always boasted about impressing. I walked into the foyer that afternoon and saw 3 of them standing by the door, their coats still on, their voices low but tense. They weren't laughing the way they usually did when they came around. One of them clutched a folder of papers, another tapped his foot impatiently. My dad's voice carried from his study, raised and desperate, promising them money he didn't have, swearing he would fix everything. My stomach tightened as I stood half-hidden on the staircase listening. He was drowning, and no amount of bluster could keep him afloat this time. Jessica appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes catching mine. She shook her head slowly as if daring me to speak, then plastered on a smile before walking to the men and offering them drinks. She slipped into the role she played so well, the polished daughter, the one who could distract and charm. My dad stormed out of his study red-faced, clutching his glass of whiskey too tightly. He laughed too loudly, insisting everything was under control, his words laced with the kind of bravado I now recognized as fear. The men did not look convinced. One of them opened the folder and slammed it down on the console table, his voice sharp as he demanded repayment. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Fraud, overdue, legal action. The words cut through the air like knives. My dad blustered, but his hand trembled as he lifted his drink. For the first time, I saw the man who had humiliated me my whole life reduced to a cornered animal. That evening, Margaret asked to see me privately. She had been quiet during the confrontation, standing back as if observing from a distance, but her eyes had taken in every detail. She told me that people like my dad survived on illusions, and once those illusions shattered, the collapse was inevitable. She showed me papers of her own, documents she had gathered through connections. They revealed the extent of his debts, the accounts he had drained, even the times he had used my name without my knowledge to secure loans. My hands shook as I read, anger rising so hot I could feel my skin burn. I asked her why he would use me, why he would sign my name. "Because he thought you were too weak to fight," she said calmly. "Because he believed you would never stand up." But now she added, "You can." Her words lodged inside me, terrifying and empowering at once. Jessica did not give up. Later that night, she cornered Michael in the kitchen, her voice lowered but her tone deliberate. I stood just beyond the doorway, my chest tightening as I listened. She told him he was blinded by love, that I was a burden he would regret, that she could see what he truly needed. Her hand brushed against his arm, her voice dipping softer, sweeter. My body shook with fury, but before I could burst in, I heard his answer. He told her clearly and firmly that he had no interest in anything she was saying, that he saw through her cruelty, that he would not abandon me. Jessica's voice cracked as she tried to recover, calling him naive, but the damage was done. He walked away from her and into the living room where I sat trembling on the couch. He looked at me, his eyes steady, and said he would stand by me no matter what. I swallowed hard tears burning behind my eyes, not because I doubted him, but because for the first time I truly believed I wasn't alone. The next day, my dad insisted we all attend a gathering at the country club. He said it was important to show face, to prove the family still commanded respect. I dreaded it, but Margaret urged me to go. Sometimes the mask must be lifted in public, she said. Sometimes people need to see the truth with their own eyes. We arrived to a room filled with polished wood and polished smiles, the kind of place where appearances mattered more than reality. My dad walked in as if nothing was wrong, Jessica clinging to his side like a polished accessory. My mother trailed behind her face, drawn her dress too carefully chosen. I walked beside Margaret just behind us, her presence like a shield. At first, the evening went smoothly. People greeted my dad, though their eyes slid toward him with something sharper than admiration. I could hear whispers as we passed fragments of sentences. Debt. Trouble. Not what it seems. Jessica tried to regain control, telling stories of her promotions, her achievements, her plans for the future. She spoke loudly, making sure every ear caught her voice. But then one of the businessmen stepped forward holding a sheaf of papers. His voice carried across the room as he asked my dad about the unpaid loans, about the signatures that did not match. Silence fell over the group. My dad's face paled, then reddened, his voice stumbling as he tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But the man pressed harder, showing the papers, pointing to my name scribbled in ink I had never touched. My knees buckled. Michael's hand gripped mine tightly, steadying me. I felt Margaret's gaze on me, strong and unyielding, silently urging me to rise. I took a step forward, my voice trembling but audible. I said I had never signed those documents, that if my name was there, it was fraud. Gasps filled the room. My dad turned toward me, his eyes wild, his mouth opening in fury. But I did not look away. The businessmen began to murmur their voices, carrying their respect crumbling. Jessica's face drained of color, her smile gone. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. The silence broke as questions erupted, voices rising around us, demanding answers. My dad stammered, his hands shaking, his body sagging under the weight of exposure. For the first time, the power was not his. For the first time, I had cut through the mask with truth. The night ended in chaos. My dad stormed out of the club, Jessica close behind, their voices raised, their steps hurried. My mother trailed after them, her shoulders hunched, her eyes empty. Michael wrapped his arm around me, his warmth steady against the chill of the winter night. Margaret walked beside us, her expression calm, though her eyes gleamed with something fierce. "You did well," she told me quietly. "This is only the beginning." Her words echoed in my mind as we drove away, the lights of the club fading behind us. My heart raced, my body trembling, but beneath the fear was something stronger, a quiet resolve. I had spoken truth in front of them all, and the world had heard. Their humiliation was no longer private. It was public, and it was only going to spread. When we returned home, the house felt hollow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the shame. My dad locked himself in his study. Jessica slammed her door, and my mother wept softly in the kitchen. I sat in the den with Michael and Margaret, staring into the fire, my body exhausted but my mind alive. I realized I no longer needed to dream of their downfall. It was happening. Not because I had screamed or fought, but because their lies were collapsing under the weight of truth. I was no longer less than nothing. I was the witness to their undoing, and soon I would be more than that. I would be the one who made sure they could never rise again. The news spread faster than even I imagined. By the next morning, the papers were filled with headlines about my dad's financial collapse. Words like fraud and unpaid debts and betrayal of trust were splashed across the pages. His face stared back from the front cover of the local news, no longer the proud patriarch he pretended to be, but a man cornered, exposed, stripped of his illusions. I stood in the kitchen holding the paper, my hands trembling, the ink smudging my fingertips. My mother sat across from me, pale and silent, her teacup untouched. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, though her absence spoke volumes. My dad had locked himself in his study and had not come out since the humiliation at the country club. For once, the house was quiet, not because peace had settled, but because the chaos had swallowed them whole. Margaret entered with her usual calm, her fur-lined coat brushing against her arms, her eyes sharp as ever. She glanced at the paper in my hand, then at me. "Do not mistake their silence for surrender," she said softly. "They are broken, yes, but broken people lash out in their final moments." I nodded, my throat tight, knowing she was right. I felt Michael's arm slip around my waist from behind his presence, steady, grounding me. He pressed a kiss to the side of my head and whispered that it was almost over. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew my family would not go quietly. They had built their lives on pride and cruelty. Watching it fall would not be enough for them to accept defeat. They would claw and scratch until there was nothing left. Later that afternoon, Jessica returned. She came down the stairs with her makeup smeared, her eyes red from crying, her movements stiff with anger. She looked at me as if I had been the one to orchestrate the ruin, her lips pressed tightly before she spat her words. "You think you have won? You think this makes you stronger than me? All you have done is destroy everything, and I will never forgive you for it." Her voice cracked, but her hatred did not. I stared back at her, the old instinct to shrink rising in me, but I forced myself to stand taller. "You destroyed it yourself, Jessica," I said quietly. "All I did was stop letting you destroy me." Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out, before she turned sharply and fled down the hall. I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest. For once, it wasn't me running away. That evening, I went to my old room to gather a few things before Michael and I left. As I packed the last of my belongings into a worn suitcase, I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me. My dad stood in the doorway, his face hollow, his shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like a stranger. Not the man who had humiliated me at the dinner table. Not the man who had poured water over my head and called me less than nothing. His voice was rough when he spoke. "You destroyed us. You destroyed this family." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "No," I said calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped letting you destroy me." The words left my mouth with more steadiness than I felt, but they were true. His face twisted, his lips trembling as if to speak again, but he said nothing. He turned and walked away, his steps heavy, leaving me with a silence that felt final. Downstairs, my mother sat at the dining table staring at nothing. Her hands were folded in front of her, but her eyes were empty, her shoulders hunched. She looked at me as I walked past, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. I waited, hoping she might at last reach for me, but she looked away, her silence cutting deeper than any insult. I realized then she had chosen her place long ago. Her loyalty was to the image, to the illusion, not to me. I walked past her without another word. When I stepped outside into the cold night air, Margaret was waiting. Michael stood beside her, my suitcase already in his hand. Margaret draped her coat over my shoulders, the warmth seeping into me as she smiled faintly. "Welcome to your new life," she said. "This is your story now." I looked at her, my throat tightening, my eyes burning with tears that spilled before I could stop them. Not tears of shame or fear, but tears of release. I nodded, my chest rising with a breath that felt like the first true one I had taken in years. We walked down the driveway together, the house behind us lit but dark in every way that mattered. I glanced back once and saw the faint outlines of my family through the window. My dad hunched in his chair, Jessica pacing, my mother sitting still as a statue. They looked small, diminished shadows of the power they once held. For the first time, I did not ache for their approval. For the first time, I felt free. In the weeks that followed, their downfall only deepened. The creditors moved swiftly, the lawsuits piled high. The whispers in town grew louder until whispers became shouts. Jessica's carefully crafted reputation crumbled as old scandals surfaced. Her promotions questioned, her achievements revealed for what they were. My dad lost his memberships, his allies, his influence. My mother faded into the background, her attempts at saving face drowned out by the truth. And me, the one they had called less than nothing, stood taller with each passing day. Margaret guided me with wisdom, reminding me that revenge was not always loud, that sometimes the quietest victories were the most lasting. Michael stood beside me through it all, his hand always steady in mine, his voice reminding me that love was not conditional, that loyalty did not need to be earned through pain. Together we built something new, fragile at first, but stronger with every step away from the past. Looking back now, I realize revenge was never about destroying them. They destroyed themselves the moment they chose cruelty over compassion, pride over truth. My victory was in surviving and standing, in refusing to accept their lies any longer. My victory was in reclaiming my dignity, my self-respect, my humanity. That is what they could never take from me. And as I sit here telling this story, I know there are others who have walked through their own storms, who have been told they are less than nothing, who have carried shame that was never theirs to bear. If you are one of them, I want you to remember this. You are not less. You are more than they will ever admit. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is not in shouting or striking back, but in rising above, in living and refusing to be broken. Tell me, what would you have done if you were me? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more stories of revenge, betrayal, and karma, do not forget to like and subscribe. Your voice matters, and so does your story.